Good afternoon, and let's get started. Thank you for joining us for our 7th webinar of the academic year. This webinar is presented by Behavioral Economics in Action at Rotman in partnership with the Behaviorally Informed Organizations Partnership. I'm Matt Hilchey, your moderator today, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher with Behavioral Economics in Action at Rotman. Behavioral Economics in Action at Rotman, otherwise known as BEAR, is a research center at the University of Toronto's Rotman School of Management, whose programmatic missions are to research, educate, and engage in meaningful outreach with our academic, governmental, and industry partners. These monthly webinars are our way of hearing firsthand from academics and practitioners who are making a meaningful impact in the world of behaviorally informed business and evidence-based public policy. Today, it's going to be my pleasure to introduce Ned Welch, an adjunct professor and executive in residence at the Rotman School of Management. Before I introduce Ned, I'd like to cover the ground rules for this webinar. Following my introduction, our speaker will deliver a 30 to 35-minute presentation. During that presentation, we encourage the audience to submit questions by clicking the chat tab on the right-hand side of your WebEx screen and by typing into the entry box. These questions will be visible to all participants. At the end of the talk, if we have some time, I'll ask Ned some of your questions. Without any further ado, I'll introduce Ned Welch. Before joining Rotman as an adjunct professor and executive in residence, Ned held senior design director and senior expert roles at McKinsey & Company's marketing practice and at McKinsey Design. In these roles, he led clients and consulting teams on topics related to insight-driven product development, innovation, product and price optimization, and customer strategy. Ned holds master's and doctorate degrees in behavioral decision theory from Carnegie Mellon University. Ned, thanks so much for being with us today. If you're all set, you can take it away.
Thanks, Matt, and happy Friday to everybody. The reason for this talk, as Matt described, is I do have a background that started, well, before I was an academic, I started my career in market research. Then I got interested in what we now call behavioral economics and spent some time at Carnegie Mellon studying that. From there, as Matt mentioned, I went into consulting, where I did a bunch of things related to marketing strategy, sort of around product and pricing and brand. Eventually got interested in product more and more and ended up leading sort of design research for a product design firm that McKinsey acquired called Lunar, which was the one of the 3 original Silicon Valley design firms and the creator of the first MacBook. The purpose of this talk is about some observations I made over the years about what it takes to be effective in delivering knowledge, expert knowledge, and behavioral insights in organizations. And the cartoon here sort of represents my feeling about what my leadership at different places I've been has always said to me about how we build these capabilities. It's a big rock to push up a big hill, and everybody's impatient. And they enjoy the ride, but I'm not always sure they fully appreciate what it takes to get there. And what I want to do is share a little bit of my pain and some insights that have come out of this over the years that I hope will be helpful. Coming out of this, I would be very interested in talking to anybody on the phone who has experiences to share, because I do believe that this is really an understudied phenomenon. There's a lot of research and management on R&D and creativity and innovation, but this question of how to matrix experts and practitioners in companies, from what I can tell, is just a little bit of a gap. So, let's see, and there we go. So here's where I think we are, and this is not just behavioral insights per se. This is relevant to a number of different insight-related activities. So design thinking could also be one, and you could apply this schema that I'm about to describe to a number of different related activities. This is the product development curve that we show our MBA students. That talks about, how a product needs to evolve over time to meet the needs of different types of users. So the typical path that you see is that at the beginning of a product's life cycle, It's being adopted by innovators and enthusiasts and people who have deep interest in the category and the features and the technology itself. Later on, as a product matures, your audience changes, and you need to be thinking more in terms of people who have less intrinsic interest in the product or the category and simply want their problem solved efficiently and economically. And I think we're at that point with behavioral insights. Starting around 2006 or 2007, I started seeing a difference in my clients and my colleagues when I described sort of behavioral economics principles, from the shoulder shrug or the sort of the quizzical look about what was wrong with me to, hey, that's really cool. I heard about that. I read Dan Ariely's book. How can we do this? So we're kind of coming out of that golden age, and a lot of people I know are struggling to figure out how we scale this, how we make it bigger. Here's another way of looking at that narrative. One way of thinking about what we've lived through with behavioral insights over the past, say, 15 years is a transition from how work got done in the early stages to how it needs to get done in the future. So the early stages of this, if you think back to, if you were familiar with Dan Ariely's book, Predictably Irrational, or you know about people like Dick Thaler and his Save More Tomorrow program, or Danny Kahneman and some of the work he's done, a lot of the early work that made behavioral insights famous came from people like Dan Ariely or Dick Thaler sitting down with CEOs of companies that reached out to them for advice and brainstorming cool things they could do. And they found a lot of cool things they could do. But here's the problem with that. There's a risk that you've sort of cherry-picked the most brilliant minds in the world and the most powerful executives in the world. And should we be surprised that they were able to do some cool stuff? I would suggest we shouldn't be. Stage two is sort of the stage a lot of us are living in right now, if you're a practitioner, which is, we stand on the shoulders of these giants, and we've learned from them, and many of us have had a lot of fun and success taking some of these low-hanging fruit and learning how to deploy them more broadly and how to extend them. But most of us who've done that have had the benefit of a fairly good reservoir of expertise to begin with, or a lot of runway to build that expertise organically because the thing is new. Where we are now and the gap that we're facing is how to extend that and amplify what we've done and get leverage to do this more broadly with teams in our companies, or without people who've had the benefit of the first two groups. And if you were to think about this, I picked the Mad Men image to represent this because I think that was sort of the early days of advertising, and you could think of this process as relevant to say advertising or market research just as well as you could for behavioral economics or design thinking. If you look at where branding is today, most of my clients who do branding feel more like the guy on the right with those stack of brand analyses than they do like the guy in the middle sitting in the seat of power on Madison Avenue, because the work has become so formalized and routinized that it's really hard to kind of keep the creativity and the progress moving forward. So this is the challenge we face. We need to get to routine, but we also, because we're in an insight business, there are limits to how far we can push that routine without sucking the insight out of it in the first place. All right, so these are a couple of things people have told me over the last couple of months as I was talking to folks about this topic. And they both contain a warning sign for us, right? One person at a large CPG company described an internal colleague as describing their insights experts as, or experts, consumer expertise, is that thing you do that I don't understand and therefore I don't trust. What we're seeing with that quote is, a, a failure at the beginning of the funnel. If we think of our business as insights practitioners, as a purchase funnel, to create understanding that lays the groundwork for successful interaction. The quote on the right came out of a design thinking workshop at a telco. I don't know what to do with this. I've got a big pile of Post-it notes. What I need is product in the pipeline. And here we've got a failure at the back end of the funnel. We may have a lot of good insights, but we haven't translated them into the impact that we need to be generating as practitioners to sustain insights as a business. And you could think of these as bookends for what we need to be doing, because whatever we're doing, insights is a business within whatever organization it lives, whether it's behavioral or consumer or something else. So what I want to do for today is to share a few representative models of how some insight activity has been organized in an organization that are indicative not of a right or wrong answer, but are indicative of different ways that firms handle this problem that highlight some pros and cons. To sort of to give you a peek ahead, I don't believe that there is a right answer, one right answer for how to organize any kind of insight activity. All of the literature that I've seen on organizational structure and organizational learning says that it depends tremendously on the task at hand, what the organization does, and a number of other factors. So we can't have a rule, but we can see some of the cause and effect relationships that seem to drive people towards success or create barriers to them. So that's my goal. We can then, out of this, highlight a few issues that are probably pain points for many organizations around how to effectively structure themselves for getting insights, and for us as individual practitioners about how to be effective inside the organizational structures we live in. Not everybody, has the ability to restructure their organization. Sometimes we just have to make the best of what we've got. And finally, the way I'm going to pull this together is to share some big ideas that have come out of a management literature over the years that have stuck with me and I think are useful for thinking about these problems. They don't necessarily provide an answer to every case, but they've helped me think about how to be successful in my career at different organizations, so including McKinsey, but also within my clients, about how to approach these problems and how to get traction and create impact. So let's look at those. And if you have questions, please do surface them. I'd be more than happy to sort of get your guys' feedback and think about opportunities to extend this. All right, so there's 3 companies I want to look at. The first one is a large consumer packaged goods company in the US, and it probably represents a fairly typical structure for organizing insights in a multi-line business. You've got a C-suite of leaderships. You have a couple of different business units, some outside North America, some inside North America, each of which has a general manager and a VP of insights. So I'm sort of tracing down the left side of this page. Each of those business units has their own insight operation. Now, in this world, we're mostly talking about traditional market research, but I happen to be friends with somebody who was standing up a behavioral insights group at this company. I'm going to talk about where it went and sort of what happened, because I think it's relevant and offers us some lessons. So in the operating companies on the left side, the insight operations that live within each business unit are do the sort of the routine heavy lifting of keeping a consumer face branded product company running. They do market intelligence, they do product and concept testing, they do brand analytics, brand strategy. They may even have they may even do sort of analytic, big data analytics, which is a growing field. This company divided its insights function between its divisions and its headquarters. So I've just described the business unit divisional structure. They also have a group at headquarters, relatively small, a handful of people who do what you might call the R&D function for insights. So this would be things like foundational research on new techniques, translational work, turning new techniques into tools that can be deployed to the field, and then actually going out and syndicating those things for adoption. This is where my friend lived and worked, and was involved in standing up this behavioral insight practice. Now, there are a couple of stories she's told over the years that I thought were really interesting. One is that is about how difficult it is to get traction as an expert practitioner in this context. One of the things you see right away is that the experts are all clustered in headquarters, and the headquarters is not necessarily very closely connected to the businesses themselves. So being distant from the problem had a couple of really important consequences. When I say the problem, I mean the delivery of the product to the customer and the development of the product and the operations that led to that delivery. Being in headquarters means you're not close to the everyday issues that line managers in the divisions are facing. So you don't necessarily have an easy time figuring out what problem to work on and which issues to prioritize. Nor do you have very close contact with the people who know what it takes to implement a particular solution. So if you think about problem solving as sort of ideas matching, sort of coming face to face with reality, there's a pretty weak connection between those. The second thing that happened was about what it took to finally get traction for behavioral insights. And I thought this was really interesting. My friend was working on this for a period of time and having very little success because it was hard to get the phone calls with the business unit folks you needed to talk to. It was hard to find a common language around what the problem might be. It was therefore hard to create a sense of relevance and sort of a burning platform for doing something. It was her good luck that the CEO of this company was fairly passionate about insights, and at some point said, "Why aren't we doing this?" And the two of them got together and created a set of activities and experiments that involved some outside experts, and the thing began to get momentum. Why do I say this? Well, the reason I say this is that having these dotted lines to authority are really important. In every insight activity, you need to have connections to people who can make things happen. And it's very difficult as a staff person, as you know, to get a business unit head to try something different if their KPIs are on the line. So this is kind of the first clue that the informal structure around an organization is really important. All right, let's look at the second example. So here's a map of how a consulting company might work. And this is probably true for most companies. This was the world I lived in for 15 years. The first thing you notice is that there aren't very many, if any, sort of solid lines of hierarchy. It's very much a pure matrix structure. And these dotted lines are, you can think of as informal networks. Everybody who lives in this world wears one or two hats. If you are an industry generalist, you live in an industry function, and you focus mostly on knowing the people and knowing the problems that people in big companies in that industry deal with. If you're a functional expert, you wear two hats. You live with your function. For me, it was originally marketing, and then it was product design or operations. You also affiliate preferentially with one or two industries that you're going to focus on. So what are the properties of this? This structure has some really nice consequences. It also has some real drawbacks. One of the nice consequences of this is that the organization is less of a hierarchy and more of a market. It's a marketplace of people with expertise and knowledge that's relevant to solving a problem. And the importance of that marketplace is it allows people with shared passions to affiliate and work together. So these networks become both important for staying employed, and they have a side consequence of being very energizing. People get to, for the most part, if they do their jobs well, to work on problems they like and problems they know something about. And it's a good mechanism for developing deep expertise and getting it to places where it's needed. What are some of the challenges of this? I wouldn't be silly enough to say that this would be a good organizational structure for my CPG friends in the previous slide. For a consulting company, the product is the knowledge, and you don't have as much of a day-to-day need to keep a factory running. So this works. But the insight that I think is worth taking away is the value of these sort of dotted line informal relationships for greasing the wheels of finding the right insight and getting it to the right person and extracting the beneficial impact on a particular problem. One thing that's sort of also useful about this is to think about where the power lies. There's no obvious center of power here, but there is power. And I'm going to come back to that question in a couple of pages, because there's some really interesting ideas on where power sits in organizations that matter for people in expert roles, because those of us in expert roles generally don't think in a way that's as sophisticated about power as our line operating colleagues, and that those gaps can really matter for the ability of experts to affect change and deliver impact that funds their work. All right, so here's the third model. So we're back in an operating company. This is a large consumer-facing service enterprise, not a product enterprise. And this is a company that has also stood up a behavioral capability, but instead of embedding it in sort of a centralized marketing function, it grew organically. This organization has a particular individual who grew up in the operating business and is deeply steeped in the sort of the problems of running different parts of the company, and became interested in behavioral economics a number of years ago. And partly on his own initiative, read everything he could and sort of hung out his shingle and started doing little projects for people he knew that use these ideas to solve practical problems that his colleagues were facing. Why do I mention this? This is a really interesting strategy, because one of the key things that seems to make experts effective in organizations is a degree of bilingualism. This is something that we always struggled to hire for at the marketing practice in McKinsey. We needed people who were literate in business, and they understood how businesses worked and had a sort of a pragmatic mindset about getting to action in an operating role, but who also had really deep expertise in some area we were interested in hiring for. And it's a very rare combination. We typically would hire people with expertise and try and train them to be business people. This friend of mine went the other way. He started by building expertise in the business and trained himself on the ideas of behavioral economics. So having that bilingualism is a challenge, but also super important. The other thing that's interesting about this example to me is that it's a pull strategy. What it highlights is it's sort of a hybrid of the two things we've looked at before. My friend in this role is a bit of an internal entrepreneur. He's using his own sort of informal network to generate opportunities that have a good marriage of need and possible solution. And the result of that is that he's been able to sort of create this virtuous cycle of finding projects that are relevant to his expertise and solvable, solving them well, and building a reputation internally as this kind of free agent miracle worker. And this is not the only person I know who's done this. Another friend of mine built a similar capability in a more traditional consumer insight space for a US CPG company, probably 25 years ago. He once described to me sort of his organization's insight deployment strategy as whoever gets to John's door first on Monday morning. That quote kind of highlights a problem with this, which is one, it's very dependent on the person who sits inside that entrepreneur box. Two, it doesn't necessarily scale very well. And three, it takes a particular kind of person to be happy in the internal consultant role. There is no formal line of authority. You are at the mercy of your colleagues for credit and recognition, because the profit and the impact that flow from your work accrues to their activities, not directly to yours. And it may or may not get institutionalized and become a capability in the firm that survives you as an individual. So how can we think about some of the challenges and opportunities that these examples highlight? I mentioned, that I spent some time at Carnegie Mellon. I've got, how much time do I have? Another 5 minutes. Let me see if I can do these idea pages at a minute a piece. I'll run a little bit long and then open things up for questions.
Now take your time. We have time.
All right, excellent. One of the things I loved about Carnegie Mellon when I was there was that it was super interdisciplinary. And I was lucky enough to work with some folks who did organizational design, industrial economics, some other things, and those ideas stuck with me. So some of these come out of that. The first is about what's called absorptive capacity. Second is which absorptive capacity is about how firms learn and what makes them good at doing new things. The second is resource dependency, which is a theory of where power comes from. The third is about networks and a very famous finding about different kinds of network connections that have different implications for various activities. And we'll talk a little bit about expertise and how you get impact from insights and how you might communicate and frame issues inside an organization to have more impact from insight or work you do, some of which is behavioral. All right, so absorptive capacity. is defined as the ability of a firm to recognize the value of new external information, to assimilate it and apply it to commercial ends. This arises from prior related knowledge and a diversity of expertise. And this is one of the important parts. It's path dependent. Failing to invest in certain kind of expertise early can make it impossible to build that capability later. This is an idea about how firms and individuals learn. And the key finding here is that firms need to be investing in R&D, and they need to be investing in new knowledge, even if those activities don't generate profits for them in a direct fashion. So if you think about an R&D lab, you may not be extracting patents out of that R&D lab, but there is very often a benefit from having that lab. And the benefit is that your firm has expertise that allows it to recognize good ideas in the outside world and be a fast follower. So you may not recognize direct benefit from the capability, but you may recognize indirect benefit. The important piece of this is that to realize those gains, the expertise needs to be connected to the business. If the lab lives in isolation, it doesn't see what the operating folks are wrestling with, and it can't provide connections to new ideas in the environment or new solutions. So this, I think, is super relevant for behavioral work, because when we build these centers of excellence, as we saw in that first example, they're not as close as they could be to the line tasks that need to be done. And the more you can make that connection tight, the better impact you can have. Now, this sounds like kind of being cross-functional, right? And it is. But what seems to happen is that cross-functionality is not always symmetric. There's a story about some of the Japanese automakers in the 1980s, when they were doing very well, sending their engineers all over the organization to learn, how different parts of the organization work. I had a client in the construction equipment business who observed in the mid-90s that one of the Japanese manufacturers of heavy construction equipment had its engineers on job sites all over the US, watching the machines be used and seeing what customers did. They were doing essentially design thinking kinds of exploratory activities. When we think about this cross-functionality, we tend to think about sending the technical people and the operational people into the field to become more like the marketers. What we don't do as often, which is good for the firm, but it's bad for people who have this sort of insight expertise. What we don't do nearly as often is send folks with the insight expertise into the operating companies to become more conversant in the engineering or operational or delivery details. And when that does happen, it can be tremendously helpful, partly because it provides a vocabulary, partly because it provides an understanding of the problem, and also because it creates these dotted line informal ties that turn out to be so helpful. All right. A second idea that comes along about the same time is this idea of resource dependency. This is a theory of power, which seems out of place for this topic, but it's not. So Jerry Salanck said, power accrues to organizational subunits that cope with critical organizational problems. And this is important, power comes from the control of scarce critical resources. So one of the perpetual complaints of folks in expert functional practices is that they don't have the power to get things done, or they feel powerless and at the mercy of other parts of the organization. And I think it's relevant for every kind of expertise, but it's especially relevant for those of us who do behavioral work. So to see that, ask yourself, is the ability to run experiments a critical part of behavioral insight? Absolutely. That's what we train our students. And it's a fundamental piece of what we do is taking useful theory and figuring out how it is going to work to solve a particular behavior change problem in a particular context. The reason this is so challenging is that when organizations house their behavioral insights in a headquarters center of excellence, those folks aren't necessarily well positioned to run experiments. The power in this field comes, if it comes from that power sits with the business unit managers, the business managers who have the authority to take chances, to take risks, to make change happen. There's a couple ways you can solve that. Right? One is the sort of the informal path through knowing the right people. Being successful at that is a process of building up credibility, communicating effectively, and showing impact. The other solution to that is a top-down one, but that requires a CEO or a senior leader who believes in the enterprise, and it requires the expert to be able to identify initiatives that will pay off, so that the credibility with that senior leader is enhanced over time, and they may sort of remain willing to exert their authority. All right. I keep talking about these dotted line ties. There's a couple reasons for that. I don't think this is new. Everybody who's ever looked for a job or read one of those books like What Color is Your Parachute has probably been exposed to it, right? There's this idea that we call the strength of weak ties. And what it means is that useful new information is most likely to come from people at the fringes of your personal network. And the principle is kind of simple. It's that the people you're really close to don't have any information that you lack, and the people who are really far away from you are inaccessible to you. So there's this sweet spot of people who are at the fringes of your network, who are most likely to tell you something that you don't already know that you can use. This is one of the reasons why the consulting matrix works for a certain kind of problem-solving activity better than the formal hierarchy structure when the formal structure creates silos. Fortunately, this is something, these dotted line ties are not prohibited in other organizations. And the folks who've been most successful in my client organizations, and even among the colleagues I used to work with at McKinsey, were the ones who were extremely committed to getting to know people in other parts of the organization. So they were curious about what those people did, and also hungry for feedback on ideas that they had. And one of the things that I personally wish I had done more of is what my wife, who's an organizational sociologist, calls the good kind of networking, which is taking ideas to people and offering them useful insights and asking them questions of mutual interest. We think of networking as instrumental, but in its purest form, it's two people with a shared interest talking about something they both like. And that's a mindset change that I think many of those of us who are in expert roles need to change. We need to sort of think less about the formal marketing of our ideas and more about the kind of empathetic curiosity with how different parts of the organization work and what they need, so that we have those connections and can bring our expertise to them at the right time. All right. One or two ideas and I'll turn it over. Behavioral insights is an expert-based profession. Psychologists have thought a lot about what expertise is. So, Danny Kahneman talks about expertise as pattern recognition built from repeated practice with feedback, and that he distinguishes between true expertise and pseudo expertise as true experts who know the limits of their knowledge. This is important to our field because it affects how we communicate. It affects how we reach compromises between our dual obligations to representing our expertise and being a voice of the canon of knowledge that we have steeped ourselves in, and our parallel obligation to be pragmatic problem solvers, and presumably better spellers than I was when I typed the word pragmatic on this page. The organizations we live in need, they don't need theory. Well, they don't need drills, they need holes, right? That's the classic quote about innovators. The risk of being an expert is to focus on toolkit more than application. The sort of bad place to end up is in the place of that design thinking consultant I mentioned earlier, who got to the end of a workshop and had the client say, I don't need a room full of post-it notes and post-it boards. I need product in my pipeline. So how can we do this? So the communication piece is key, and I think it's a huge opportunity for people in research roles. There's lots of bad ways to communicate research. The quote on the left is a paraphrase of something I used to see on documents all the time, which is somebody does some qualitative research, and because qualitative researchers are adhere to their professional values around small samples, they will say something on page 1 like, this analysis based on qualitative interviews, it may not be representative, results should be used with caution. Lots of credit to the person who wrote anything like this for their intellectual integrity. But the truth is that saying things like this to a senior manager is shooting yourself in the head, because it essentially communicates, I don't know anything. It's equally easy to sin on the other side, which is, to take those same 9 interviews and create a chart like the one on the right that says customers prefer X to Y by 2 to 1 based on, a couple of qualitative unstructured interviews. This is something consultants do all the time, and it drives me and our client experts and many of our senior executives insane. So the right approach has to be somewhere in the middle. If you think about Danny Kahneman's quote of or his ideas about expertise, it leads you to a different way to talk. It leads you to say, what you know to be true, what you know to be not true. It gives you permission to speculate under certain conditions, right? You can have speculative findings based on a well-articulated rationale and a sort of a clear communication of what you don't know or what you need to know to believe them. And this idea of need to believe is it's a term of art that consultants use. It sounds like jargon, but it's actually very useful. If you do it right, it gives you a laundry list of things to check out to decide if a particular speculation is credible or not. So the difference between a need to believe and a disclaimer, like the one on the previous page, is that the disclaimer is non-directive. It just says it says you can't really believe any of this with a high degree of certainty. A need to believe says that this is a claim I think is true, and here is the exact punch list of facts you need to gather to decide if it's true or not. And then finally, you as an expert, you may have a role saying what you know to be unknown. It's very important. The only fight I ever had with a colleague in 15 years at McKinsey was some work I did in Europe, where they have different ideas about what expertise means. We were presenting to a CEO of a publishing company. My colleague asked me for an opinion on a particular topic. I said, I don't know. And he pounded the table and said, you're the expert. You're supposed to know. And my answer is no. I'm the expert. I'm supposed to tell you what is known and what isn't known. And that topic isn't known. All right. So last 2 slides, and then I'll turn it over to you guys for questions. This idea of impact. Impact is what our companies want from us. And it comes from a combination of insight and action. We used to say, our consultants say all the time that, an idea is an idea until it's on a PowerPoint. because unfortunately for consultants, the PowerPoint is the action, is the product. In the real world, it's just the beginning of the process, but the moral of the story is the same. This page exists for, I wrote this page for my MBA students to help them sort out two different kinds of insight activities. So if you look at these 4 stages, the first and the last stage are less interesting. The first is, you sort of figure out what you need to learn, and the second is you implement the solution. It's the middle 2 that are important. There's what I call could be research and should be research. Could be research is divergent. It's about discovering a long list of possible explanations for a phenomenon, or possible interventions to a behavior change problem, or possible solutions to some other kind of problem. And it's non-statistical. If you are trying to design a new product and one person in the world says that this benefit would be useful, you can put it on your list. You don't need to prove at this stage that it's profitable. You just need to know that it's one way of solving that customer's need. The second is what I call should be research. This is where you start making a business plan. This is where you figure out what works, what's most or least effective, and it is quantitative, and it is rigorous, and it is convergent. You want to get to the end of that with a very short list of things to go do. The reason I mention this is that lots and lots of organizations confuse these two. So a classic thing that happens is that you're doing brainstorming research and somebody says no but. Well, what that represents is a failure of divergence in the could be stage. The other thing that happens is that people are in the should be stage, and they throw up their hands because they can't prioritize things. And that's a failure of the analytics to identify the right variables that need to be addressed. So my last slide is about one path through some of those models, particularly at the end stage. And I'm going to skip the story about Samuelson's bet and just jump to the headline. A lot of things that we do in behavioral insights work represent a multitude of changes to a product or a service, some of which are hard to evaluate individually based on impact. So I'll be specific. I did, one of the types of work I used to do was doing feature optimization for consumer electronic companies. So think about a flat panel TV or a laptop computer. The redesign would involve decisions about everything from the LCD screen, which might be a $100 component, to the HDMI ports, which might be a 25-cent component. The engineers want to know the value to the end user of an incremental HDMI port. Getting that answer is almost impossible economically. The trick that I found over the years was why do they want that number? It's a kind of myopia. It's focusing on a particular decision and trying to treat that decision in isolation. And very often, that myopic focus makes your life impossible, and it makes your insights unaffordably complex. Well, so you just can't get there. How do you do it? One of the ways that works is to think about prioritizing. It's a lot easier to prioritize initiatives than it is to numerically evaluate them. So in that example of the TV, right, we might have had a dozen 50-cent features that our client needed to think about. It would have been very hard to rigorously quantify the price impact of any one of them, but through triangulation and across a couple of different techniques, it wasn't impossible to get consensus across the different decision makers about which ones were relatively more valuable than others. The reason that this is important, if I step back from that TV example, is that there are lots and lots of decisions that we make and opportunities for insight, where stepping back and treating decisions as a class will help managers be wiser than if you sort of let them follow their noses down the garden path and get lost in the weeds. I'm going to stop there because, as Mark Twain said, I apologize for writing you a long letter. I didn't have time to write you a short one. So I welcome your questions, and particularly ask me what the hell I was thinking with a particular idea, because I would love to make this better and to learn from you guys about some of the challenges you face.
Ned, thanks a lot. That was a very wide sweeping and circumspect talk that I certainly got a lot out of. I appreciated your insights, firsthand insights, some that many of us don't have access to. We got a few questions here in the chat. We don't have very much time. I'm going to try to get through them reasonably quickly. If we can try to limit your response to maybe 60 seconds per question.
Let's go for 20, and we'll take it from there.
All right, so this kind of harks back to the beginning of the talk. I believe this question was posed very, very early on. When you're talking about perhaps a lack of trust in behavioral economics and skepticism in it, the audience member wonders whether this can be attributed squarely to a lack of understanding in the BE space. The first question, and whether there's more to it than that. Any comments on that? Is the lack of trust attributable specifically to a failure to understand BE?
It could be. I think the lack of trust, in my experience, the lack of trust has more to do with knowing where to start and risk aversion. It's very difficult to, one of the reasons it's hard to get these capabilities started is that when on day one, somebody has to sign up for an experiment that might hurt their bottom line. And in fact, the last page that, hold on, I don't know, I guess I'm still sharing my screen, so you're seeing it even though, the last one quote that that sort of somebody mentioned to me was a GM rejecting an experiment saying, he was a sales guy saying, who's going to pay me back for lost units on my KPI? There's a lot of risk aversion around experimentation. One place, I think I've hit my 60 seconds. I'll just say quickly, one place BE works well is executive coaching on managerial decision making. And I think one reason for that is that there are fewer steps between the intervention and the decision maker seeing value from the intervention. You're basically talking to an executive about his own bias, and there's less risk.
Okay, I think that partly addresses the second question that appeared in the chat. Obviously, to address any kind of a concrete operational way, some form of experimentation is presumably necessary. The question that this audience member has was, what would you recommend for instilling that kind of culture in organizations that have processes and managers that maybe aren't used to tinkering, perhaps partly because they're risk averse? But maybe you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, I think the focus is a pragmatic one on de-risking experimentation, or what I'll say is de-risking change. One of the things that, and this is where behavioral economics and more traditional research and insights, I think, can profitably collaborate. One of the things I did a lot of was addressing clients' anxiety about product or service changes that the experts on our team were very confident would be successful. And the thing we needed to do was not to try and persuade clients to take risks on the basis of somebody's opinion, but to find clever ways to resolve the uncertainty that was underneath that anxiety so that our clients could feel comfortable making those decisions themselves. And that involves a degree of research sophistication to figure out what are those critical need to believes and how could we triangulate on those key variables in a selective way. People talk about this as triangulation or hybrid research, which is a combination of lab and field, right? You take the control from the lab to understand in a sort of a contrived setting phenomenon that are really important in the real world, but hard to test there.
Thanks, Ned. So we have about 1 minute left here. There are a lot of good questions left in the chat. Obviously, we don't have time to get to them. I know you mentioned earlier that you were interested in reaching out to people. Maybe if you want to put contact information somewhere on the screen so people can reach out to you.
Yep.
They do have questions, and I believe that people are self-identified in the chat anyway, if you wanted to reach out, but I'm not sure. People will be okay with that. Maybe you just provide your own personal information here.
I'll put my email up. Can you see?
Yeah, I can see it. That's great. So I'm sure Ned's happy to chat with you.
Certainly happy to. Yeah.
I'm going to do my my sign off now, so I get in under the hour. But
coffee is out of the question, but email and phone always work.
Thanks, Ned. Really
all right,
appreciate
thanks, Matt. And thank you all for your patience, and I look forward to future sessions like this.
Thanks, Ned.
Okay, bye.
Hi. Full recording of this webinar will be available at our website by clicking on the side tab labeled Events and then clicking on the sub-tab labeled Bear Webinar Series. Just to let you know, our next webinar is going to be held on April 16th, at which point we'll be discussing with Catherine Young, who's an Associate Professor of Marketing at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Thank you all again for attending. We'll see you next time. You can exit this webinar by closing your WebEx screen. Bye.